This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news recorded at 1400 hours GMT on Wednesday, the 31st of January. I'm Valerie Sanderson with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, reaction from the US following President Trump's maiden State of the Union address.
This, in fact, is our new American moment. There has never been a better time to start living the American dream.
After a series of deadly attacks across Afghanistan, a network of BBC reporters assesses the scale of the militant threat in all parts of the country.
We just got fired at by the Taliban. Now the police are returning the fire and I need to run for cover.
Also in this podcast, a Turkish court has ordered the release of the local head of the human rights group Amnesty International. We find out the details. An emergency meeting on the humanitarian situation in Gaza is underway in Brussels. Britain's Prime Minister Theresa May has begun a visit to China, where some people have positive images of the UK.
It's a country with deep culture, the empire on which the sun never sets, right? It's Cambridge University, clean streets, disciplined people.
But will that translate into greater trade between the two nations? We meet Wiki.
1, 2, 3.
A killer whale that's communicating with humans. And a rare lunar event will light up the skies tonight. So, what will the super blue blood moon look like?
It looks brighter and it looks better when they go out and see it on a supermoon. There's no finer sight in the night sky to me.
But first, the United States has been waking up the morning after the night of President Donald Trump's first State of the Union address. His bullish speech declared the country had reached a new American moment. He hailed a strong economy and included a call for unity among politicians in Washington and the country as a whole. President Trump said Americans shared the same values.
Tonight, I want to talk about what kind of future we're going to have and what kind of a nation we're going to be. All of us together as one team, one people, and one American family can do anything. We all share the same home, the same heart, the same destiny, and the same great American flag.
The Democratic response was given by the Massachusetts Congressman Joseph Kennedy III, a great-nephew of President John F. Kennedy. He accused Republicans of ignoring the needs of millions of ordinary Americans.
Many have spent the last year anxious, angry, afraid. We all feel the fractured fault lines across our country. We hear the voices of Americans who are forgotten and feel forsaken. We see an economy that makes stocks soar, investor portfolios bulge, and corporate profits climb, but fails to give workers their fair share of the reward. A government that struggles to keep itself open. Russia, knee-deep in our democracy. An all-out war on environmental protection. A Justice Department rolling back civil rights by the day.
Our Washington correspondent Rajini Vajanathan was inside the House chamber on Capitol Hill for the address.
I think the thing I was struck by most is I was sitting at the top so I could look down and see the Republicans who were all sat on one side and the Democrats who were all sat on the other side. And for the Republicans who were watching the president's speech, this was a kind of sense of celebration. They were standing ovation after standing ovation as they leapt to their feet every time the president mentioned a key policy area. And towards the end, they even had sort of feeling of a Trump rally that I've been to a lot during the campaign, with Republicans chanting USA, USA, and as I say, rapturous, rousing applause. But contrast that to the other half of the room, where Democrats sat silent and stony-faced throughout most of the speech, and very few took to their feet at some of those key policy mentions. And in a way, that sort of resembles or just typifies the division that we see across America as well when it comes to some of the key policies that the president was highlighting in that speech.
he was calling, wasn't he, for unity. Was that your sense of what he'll get, or do you think really this will go down very well with his key electorate voters and not so well with others who don't like him?
Well, this is certainly a speech that will have been well received from his base. Don't forget, of course, I watched it in the chamber, but millions of people will have watched it around America. It has a prime time slot on US TV, and it's a sort of political event that actually does get people sort of sitting up and taking notice. And some of the policies in there, not just the stuff on immigration, but the promise to keep Guantanamo Bay open, talk about, you know, support for police and respecting the flag. Those kinds of mentions will go down very well with his base. And of course, the other half of the country that doesn't agree with his position on things like immigration, well, they won't have liked what he said. But really, remember, this is also a pitch ahead of the midterm congressional elections later this year. So the entire House of Representatives and a third of the Senate will be up for re-election. So everyone in that room last night knows that they have to be very, very mindful of the fact that these policies will have to register well with the base. And so certainly I think this speech will have done exactly what he wanted in terms of keeping that base solid. In terms of whether or not he can win people over, well, it certainly was definitely something that was maybe a call for unity, but whether or not it will actually deliver that unity across the country is something that remains to be seen.
Well, in his speech, President Trump made virtually no reference to Afghanistan, where more than 2,000 US personnel lost their lives in the war against the Taliban. And maybe this is why. A BBC investigation suggests that the Taliban are now openly active in 70% of the country. A network of BBC reporters across Afghanistan spoke to more than 1,200 individuals in every district of the country to build up a broad picture of all militant attacks over a period of 3 months. In Helmand, where hundreds of British, American and Afghan troops died fighting the Taliban, nearly half of the territory has fallen into the hands of the militants. It now experiences more deaths from the conflict than any other province in the country. Our reporter Aliya Atrafi has been to the front line on the outskirts of Lashkargah.
Over 10,000 people live in this makeshift camp on the outskirts of Lashkargah in Helmand province. They fled their villages to escape the fighting between the Taliban and the Afghan security forces. Here I meet Zarif, a father of 5. His family abandoned their home under a rain of bullets.
We were celebrating an engagement party when the shell landed. 2 children and 2 women were killed. My aunt lost her eye.
Not just Zarif, but everyone else sitting around me has a similar story. Here, Muhammad Riza was one of the richest men in town. He had pomegranate orchard, and now he says he doesn't even have a blanket to sleep in. Muhammad Qasim's son here was blown away by a shell, and his right arm is not working now. Shaista Khan's 2 legs were blown away by a Taliban mine. Now he's saying that the war took my life from me. The Afghan war became more violent and widespread in 2017. A BBC investigation has found that the Taliban now has an active presence in almost 70% of the country. The power and the reach of the militants has been growing since foreign troops pulled out in 2014. Helmand was the base of the British Army in Afghanistan. Hundreds of soldiers died defending the territory. But after they pulled out, almost half of the province fell to the Taliban. We're traveling inside an armored vehicle with Afghan police to a forward operation base that literally means a front line, stopping the Taliban from entering Lashkargah, the provincial capital. We just got fired at by the Taliban. Now the police are returning the fire and I need to run for cover. This is their front line and it shows how volatile it is. Although we are told this is normally quiet during the day, but this shooting proves otherwise. Night is particularly bad. Muhammad Azim, one of the soldiers on the front line, tells me that sometimes the shooting lasts for 3 to 4 hours. Other times it's more random and goes on for the entire night. You can't predict it. But what's it like for the many Afghans who find themselves now living in an area where the Taliban are active? I spoke to a farmer on the front line. We cannot identify him to protect his safety. He told me it's a living hell. Every day he pleads with both sides not to use their village as a battlefield.
The Taliban fool the community with their propaganda. They don't care. At least the government listens to you. The Taliban will say it's not their problem.
Last year was the bloodiest year for Helmand.
That's the assessment of the governor of Helmand, Hayatullah Hayat. He believes there's only one solution.
Here in Helmand, I'm treating both the widows of Taliban, the orphan of Taliban, and also the orphan or widows of the Afghan military officers and soldiers. Because majority of the Taliban are Afghans. So we cannot reach conclusion or peace in this country with force and fighting. So I call on the Taliban that peace, negotiation, jirgas, and talks are the only way to reach us to the final peace process in Afghanistan.
Hayatullah Hayat, the governor of Helmand province in Afghanistan, ending that report by Aliya Atrafi. Now to Turkey, where a court's ordered the release of the local head of the human rights group Amnesty International, who's on trial on terror charges. Our correspondent Mark Lowen, who's in Istanbul, told me more about today's hearing.
Well, this is the local head of Amnesty called Taner Kılıç, and he has been in detention, or he was in detention since last June. He was accused, Valerie, of downloading an internal messaging application called Bylock that the government says was downloaded by those involved in plotting the failed coup here in July 2016. He and his family and his lawyers deny ever having downloaded that application, and Amnesty International said forensic tests carried out on the phone show that it was never downloaded. And so finally he has been released on bail, but he is still facing trial on charges of membership of a terrorist organisation, and the government maintains that he was somehow involved in downloading Bylock, even if the charges weren't strong enough to keep him in detention until the trial takes place.
He's not the only one, is he? 11 human rights activists in total face terror charges, don't they?
Yeah, there's a group called the Amnesty 10. This is human rights activists, including another high-ranking director of Amnesty here, but also foreign nationals that were accused by the government of taking part in some kind of workshop against plotting another coup, basically. They were on an island close to Istanbul, and last July, a year after the failed coup, police burst in on their workshop. They say it was a spiritual, holistic workshop, and they were arrested, and the government says that they were involved in membership of a terrorist organisation. They and their lawyers say it's absolute rubbish. They were simply taking part in sessions about, for example, working in human rights in a repressive atmosphere and a sort of authoritarian regime. And they were finally also released on bail, but again, they face an ongoing trial of alleged membership of a terrorist organisation. Amnesty launched a worldwide campaign to try to free them and Taner Kılıç. It appears that those efforts have paid fruit in terms of releasing them on bail, but as I say, their trial continues.
Mark Lowen speaking to me from Istanbul. As we recorded this podcast, an emergency conference on the humanitarian situation in Gaza is underway in Brussels. It's a meeting of the International Donor Group for Palestine, known as the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee. Israeli and Palestinian representatives will also use the event to try to get the peace process back on track. Now Al-Assad from BBC Arabic, who's at the conference in Brussels, told us more.
The EU called for this meeting following meetings with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who was here mid-January in Brussels. The meeting is urgent because the Palestinian Authority is facing financial shortages following the US President Donald Trump's announcement that he's going to stop giving aid to Palestinians. This committee was created in 1993 following the signing of the Oslo Agreement. It's a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, which was supposed to lead to the creation of a Palestinian state following negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians after 5 years. This did not happen. 25 years later, the situation is dire because talks between Palestinians and Israelis stalled many times. The last talks took place in 2014. And also following the announcement of the US President Donald Trump that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, it created a crisis between the Palestinian Authority and the US, who is mediating these peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. The importance of this meeting that actually, for the first time since the 6th of December, Palestinians, Americans, Israelis are sat together here in Brussels for the first time to discuss ways to resume talks on the basis of a two-state solution, which is the Palestinians' demand.
Is there much optimism they can make headway on that?
It depends who you are hearing the answer from. If you ask the Palestinians think that they cannot continue any negotiations without guarantees that East Jerusalem will be the capital of their future state in 1967 borders. If you ask the Israelis, they say that they want the Americans to mediate this deal and Jerusalem is their eternal capital. If you ask the Europeans are quite hopeful by saying that there is no peace negotiated deal without the American involvement in these talks, and they are definitely putting more weight into these talks by calling for this meeting.
Now Al-Assad of BBC Arabic. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's in the world this week, and the programme is also available to download from our website at www.bbc.co.uk/programmes. Relations between Britain and China are entering a golden era, so say Premier Li Keqiang and Prime Minister Theresa May after meeting at Beijing's Great Hall of the People. It's the first day of Mrs May's visit to the country, which is aimed at strengthening trade ties with the world's second largest economy. Her delegation includes representatives from 50 UK companies, and the trip's being seen by many as a test of Britain's ability to forge new economic partnerships ahead of Brexit. But as our China correspondent John Sudworth reports, getting China to lift some of its barriers to UK business may not be so easy.
The Chinese economy is still galloping along, creating 5,000 new millionaires a week. This riding stables is the first here to be accredited by the British Horse Society. Just one example of how China's growing middle classes could help boost UK trade in a post-Brexit world.
British brands tend to be a lot quieter than other brands, more discerning.
Alex Hua Tian has put his money where his mouth is, or at least his passport. He gave up his UK nationality to ride for China at the Olympic Games, and he's now an ambassador for the British Horse Society in China.
I think here in China, the Brits have to keep their cool, keep their identity, but at the same time I think they can take it up a notch and compete a little bit more and elbow their way in a little bit more in comparison to other brands and other cultures.
Jaguar Land Rover is one iconic British brand that has elbowed its way in. On a tour of its state-of-the-art factory near Shanghai, the message is all about expansion and the plan to increase capacity to 200,000 cars a year.
So how quickly can you make the cars here?
About 106 seconds we will offline.
One car every 106 seconds?
Yeah, and about 34 jobs per hour.
34 cars an hour?
Yeah.
But there are challenges too. The company has tried in vain to get China to halt production of a local start-up brand that, it says, is based on an almost exact replica of one of its designs, even down to the name, not Land Rover, but Land Wind. For many other British companies, just getting into China in the first place can be tough. Despite all the talk of a golden era in diplomatic and trade relations, China has done little to lower its barriers in sectors where the UK is traditionally strong, like finance, healthcare and insurance. But for Jaguar Land Rover's China director, Pan Qing, the opportunities still far outweigh the risks, and he wants the UK to get serious about its China strategy.
For a country like China, the dialogues is extremely important because two nations are so different. Cooperation starts with understanding. That is absolutely necessary. And I can only encourage the PM, but also on the dedicated levels for different industries, with the different ministry levels, that we started much more intensive dialogues.
Does the golden era still exist?
For whom?
Britain-China.
I think it is still yet to come.
Meanwhile, China is busy fashioning its own future. Ju Hong is a Beijing-based designer with a shop in London and reams of ambition about where her country is heading.
China has had master craftsmen since ancient times. The Forbidden City, the Great Wall, they all reflect our craftsman spirit. And these show us that China is not just the world's factory, but the world's high-end factory.
Her workers have some fairly positive views of the distant land in which some of their products are now worn.
If I ever go to the UK, I'll be very interested in looking at the hats the women wear. Almost all of them wear hats.
It's a country with deep culture, the empire on which the sun never sets, right? It's Cambridge University, clean streets, disciplined people.
The Chinese government, though, may be a little more strategic. While the UK wants more deals and more access, in a post-Brexit world, China may find itself asking, who needs who the most?
A report from John Sudworth. Researchers have found that people affected by cancer tend to survive much longer than they used to because treatments have improved. But it still depends on the type of cancer people get and where they live. Professor Michel Coleman from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine is one of the lead researchers.
Well, we looked at survival from 18 different cancers that, taken together, represent 3/4 of all the cancers diagnosed worldwide. And we looked at trends in survival over the 15 years from 2000 to 2014. We've seen progress in survival from breast cancer, from melanoma, from cancers of the large bowel, or the colon and the rectum. And we've seen survival improve for malignancies in children, particularly acute lymphoblastic leukemia. That's a type of leukemia that is the most common cancer in children worldwide. The chances of survival differ not only with the type of cancer that a person may have developed, but also the country in which they live. Obviously, the amount of money that you spend on your health service is a significant factor in influencing outcomes, not just from cancer, but from other diseases. Some countries have managed to do quite well despite having relatively low expenditure because they organize their systems better, and maybe it's less expensive to hire doctors or buy machines, radiotherapy machines, for example, in their country. But I'll give you an example. In Costa Rica, the survival from breast cancer is really quite high, and that we believe is a reliable figure. In Brazil, there has been progress in childhood leukemia due to better treatments. And in some countries in Asia, including Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, for example, survival from stomach cancer and cancer of the gullet or the esophagus is extraordinarily high because of the way they organize access to care.
Professor Michel Coleman of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Now, a killer whale that can apparently talk. Scientists in Scotland say Wiki, who lives at an aquarium in Antibes in France, has learned to speak some words through her blowhole by copying her trainer.
Hello. Hello.
Our correspondent Helen Briggs told me more.
Well, she may not win any prizes for diction, but I think you can make out that she was saying hello. And this is a teenage killer whale, and she's been taught how to copy a repertoire of words, words like hello, bye-bye, Amy, and 1, 2, 3. And she can also blow raspberries rather impressively. And scientists are astonished by this because they say it's the first time they've ever seen a killer whale doing this.
Well, let's hear her blow a raspberry. This is copying, is it? Is there a time when they're going to be able to have a conversation with Wiki?
Well, the scientists aren't ruling it out, but what they're saying is that really what she's doing is imitating. And that alone is really interesting because there aren't too many animals that can do this. The obvious one is a parrot. They can copy words, and some other birds. But when you go higher up, very few mammals can imitate speech. Obviously, it's a hallmark of being human. We're the masters at it. But apart from humans, only a handful of other creatures, most of them, interestingly, are marine mammals, so whales and dolphins. And there's also elephants possibly can imitate speech, but they're not quite sure about that.
And some birds, of course.
Parrots and some members of the crow family can do it.
So what does this tell us about the communication of whales in the wild?
Well, first of all, this has only been done on one killer whale in captivity, so we don't quite know what's going on in the wild. But there are some interesting clues because killer whales in the wild, different pods of killer whales, have different dialects, so they're a bit like us. So depending on where you go, you hear people speaking
Scottish accents.
Yes, Scottish accents, Geordie accents, people speaking in slightly different ways because they're hearing that and it's sort of growing up around them. And it seems that whales do this too. So scientists have long wondered where these dialects come from in whales. And if you listen to whales, you can actually hear that. Scientists can actually hear that difference. And so probably what's happening, although this hasn't been directly tested, is that killer whales in the wild may be just copying those around them. And then this particular killer whale, Wiki, at her aquarium in France, she can copy other killer whales quite well. And also killer whales have been known to copy other marine animals, so sea lions and things like that.
Helen Briggs on Wiki the whale. And finally,
Blue moon, you saw me standing alone without...
The wonderful Ella Fitzgerald with the classic song Blue Moon. And skywatchers in some parts of the world have the rare opportunity to witness a blue moon, which for North America, Australia and parts of Asia is also blood red and super. Lots of adjectives there. Dr. Elizabeth Pearson, who's the news editor for the BBC's Sky at Night magazine, explains.
A blue moon is a moon which it won't actually be blue in colour, I'm sorry. It's what we could say when we have two full moons in one calendar month. And that happens occasionally because the lunar cycle is about 29 days, but most months are only 30 or 31. So occasionally there's a mismatch and we get 13 full moons in 1 year. The term started because there was a thing called a blue moon where the moon actually looks blue, and that doesn't happen very often at all. It's usually to do with, ice clouds or volcanoes exploding. And so people started using the term once in a blue moon, and because this happens so rarely, that's when people started calling it blue moon. The supermoon is when the moon is closest to Earth. So but actually both of the new moons in this month have been supermoons. They've been very close to Earth, and that happens because the moon's orbit is slightly elliptical. It's not a perfect circle. And sometimes when it's a full moon, it's slightly closer to Earth than at other times, and it'll appear larger and brighter in the sky by up to as much as about 30%. With the supermoons, it's quite often, it's not a huge difference, but some people sort of say maybe it's a psychological thing, but it looks brighter and it looks better when they go out and see it on a supermoon. I always think it's worth going out and seeing the full moon when you know it's up. If you've got a nice clear night, there's no finer sight in the night sky to me. In America, they've got a rare conflagration of 3 different lunar effects. There's a blue moon, it's a supermoon, but for them it's also a blood moon. What that means is there's a lunar eclipse going on. So the moon will be passing into the Earth's shadow and it will appear red on the sky. And that one, it actually will look red on the sky.
Dr. Elizabeth Pearson, the news editor for the BBC's Sky at Night magazine. And you can find out more on this if you go to bbc.com/news, where you'll find some lovely pictures of previous blood moons and supermoons. And that's it from us for now. An updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. But we'll end this edition with a bit more of the fabulous Ella Fitzgerald.
Now I'm no longer alone.
And if you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Until next time, goodbye.
Of my own.